We'll start this lecture with non-uniform memory access. So what we have been seeing in the previous lectures is that we have CPU, one CPU or a set of CPUs, and we have memory. In comparison, we can have a non-uniform memory access system where instead of one CPU, we have multiple CPUs. The CPUs are connected to each other. And furthermore, there is a memory bank which is close to each CPU, as you can see over here. Okay, so as you can see over here, close to every CPU or set of CPUs, there is memory that is close to it. All right. So basically, the latency from, let's say, CPU 0 to memory 0 is comparatively much lower than the latency from CPU 0 to, let's say, memory 1. So such kind of systems are known as non-uniform memory access systems or NUMA systems. So optimal performance in this case will come from allocating memory which is close to the CPU, in the sense that, let's say, if there is a program running over here, the optimal performance will come if the data of this program is located in this memory block. Furthermore, we also need to work at the scheduler level. So we need to modify the scheduler to schedule threads such that they are close to their data. They are close to the memory modules that contain their data. Solaris has been a pioneer in this, mainly because Sun was one of the early companies that had these large systems. So Solaris has created something called an I group. So I group is basically a data structure to track the CPU memory latency of groups, and so it is possible to actually create a group of CPUs and memory modules. So let's call this an I group. And so I stand corrected. It's not a data structure, but it's a hardware structure along with data structures in the kernel to manage it. So whenever possible, we take the threads of a process and try to allocate all the memory for that within its I group. So the I group is basically at the hardware level. It's a group of interconnected CPU as well as memory modules. And we can also have we can also have a scheduling and a paging system within an I group, right? And as far as possible, we schedule all the processes that we can within the I group. All right. So this keeps the data and the compute local. So let's now discuss a phenomenon which is present in all kinds of systems, both UMA systems, uniform memory access systems, and non-uniform memory access systems. So let's say that a process does not have enough pages in memory, then it will have a lot of page faults. So any page fault by definition will replace an existing frame, and this process of reading in memory data will lead to low CPU utilization. And furthermore, what will happen is that because your CPU is kind of low, it's not computing much because most of the time is going in IO, the operating system would think that maybe it needs to schedule more threads on the CPU or increase the degree of multiprogramming. As a result, the number of currently active threads which are running, that will increase, because threads come, they don't find the data, they go into IO mode. Then the scheduler thinks that maybe I need to increase the number of threads because the CPUs are not being utilized. As a result, more threads come and more are the page faults. So this process can sort of lead to a terminal state, and this phenomenon is known as thrashing, right? Where we basically are not able to run anything, primarily because when a process comes, it doesn't find its pages in memory, it then goes to memory to fetch them. At the same time, the CPU schedules other threads also do the same. And also the number of threads keep on increasing because the kernel sees that the CPUs are not active. So if I were to show a diagram of thrashing with the degree of multiprogramming on the x-axis and the CPU utilization on the y-axis, so what we'll find is that after a certain level, after a certain point, when we have a lot of threads in the system, where the degree of multiprogramming can be correlated with the number of active threads that we have in the system. So as this increases, your CPU utilization will continue to increase, but actually after a certain point it will start decreasing, and that too quite abruptly. And the reason being that we will not be able to fit in the data of all of these threads in main memory. So the phenomenon of thrashing will happen, and that is where the system throughput will reduce, and that too it will reduce quite substantially. Alright. So the key point is that whatever is our degree of multiprogramming, it has to be the left of this dotted line, not to the right. And of course, there is a clear optimal region, which is possibly this region. But we need to track the page faults. So modern kernels have a lot of modules to track the page faults and avoid thrashing at all costs. So demand paging and thrashing. So let's look at why exactly does demand paging work. Well, the point is that processes keep migrating, or let's say they have an IO request and they go to the disk and they remain in the waiting state, and later they come up and later they come up. So what we don't want to do is that we don't want to lock up large parts of the memory with the working sets of processes which are waiting for a long latency IO event. As a result, we swap them out. Gradually their pages get replaced and newer programs can take over. Newer other processes can take over. Why does thrashing occur? Well, the reason that thrashing occurs is that if let's say we compute the sum of what is called the size of locality, or the sum of the number of pages that a process needs in a short duration of time, if this is greater than the total memory size, then of course we'll have havoc, because processes will come, they will wait most of the time for IO, and they will also end up displacing the pages of other processes. They will come, they will also wait most of the time for IO, and this is when the kernel is going to increase the number of active threads that are running. So of course we can change the page replacement algorithms. For example, to prevent thrashing, we can simply give more priority to processes which have come earlier and which are waiting for an IO request to finish, so we can keep their pages in main memory. So as a result, newer processes will not be able to make progress, but at least the old ones will be able to. That is one solution. So similar diagrams, as you can see, for different page numbers are used to look at their locality in the sense when they are used. So if you, let's say, consider memory address 28, it's not used for a major part of the time and then it's suddenly used. Some pages are used all the time, some are not used and then they are used. So you can see that we have a complicated execution pattern, and this is captured in the behavior of the system when demand paging is on. But modern operating systems try a lot to understand this pattern, predict future patterns, try to maximize the throughput without getting into thrashing. So let's now discuss the idea of the working set. So a working set is basically a window which is a fixed number of page references. And let's assume that it is the number of page references within the last 10,000 instructions. So for process Pi, the working set I is the total number of pages referenced in the most recent delta. Okay, so delta is clearly a contentious thing because this has not been defined formally as such. But what delta means is that it is some period of time that captures the steady state behavior of at least that phase of the application. Right? So it's not too small, it's not too large. For example, if delta is too small, it will simply not encompass the entire locality, the entire set of data that the process accesses. So it can't be too small. It can't be too large because then it will encompass several localities, in the sense it will look at a broad range of memory regions. And of course, if it's infinity, it will encompass the entire program. But choosing the appropriate delta to determine the working set, where the working set is defined as the set of pages that a program requires at a given point in time, right? And that point in time is actually a duration. It is the number of references made within a duration, but the duration itself is kind of vaguely defined, as you are seeing. So in this case, what we can do is that if we add up the working sets, this is the total number of frames that we are demanding. And what we have seen in our discussion on thrashing is that this quantity needs to be less than the size of the main memory. Alright. So this will give us some approximation of locality, and if this is less than the size of main memory, we can then say that we can accommodate all the working sets. So as I said, if D is greater than M, where D is this quantity, if this is greater than the memory capacity, then we'll have thrashing. So we can have a working set estimator algorithm where we can look at a steady state of a process and look at the number of pages it is accessing. And if we find D to be greater than M, then we can suspend one process or we can swap it out. Alright, so we can simply swap out the process at that point of time. And that will work. So if you look at this, if you're considering a given thread, and if let's say our duration delta, the working set turns out to be 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, these are all the pages that it is accessing. Similarly, what you can see is that towards this region, the behavior of the program has changed. So then at a different point of time, so T1 stands for time, right? I mistakenly said thread, but T1 and T2 stand for time. So at a different point of time, of course, the working set has changed. Instead of 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, which were the dominant accesses at this point, we can set the working set to just 3, 4. That's all. So the working set in itself changes. So how do we keep track of the working set? This in itself is a complicated problem somewhat. So the way that we can do this is that we can have an interval timer. The interval timer will run for, let's say, a certain number of time units. So let's assume that the duration of the interval timer is 10,000 time units. The timer interrupts after every 5,000 time units. So let's assume we have 2 bits per page, a reference bit and a copy of the reference bit. So we will see where that's supposed to be used. So whenever a page is accessed, so let's assume it's not there and then there's a page fault, it's brought in and then the page is accessed. Or what we can do is to track the page accesses, we can set its permissions as, so we can kind of trigger a page fault that will tell us the page access sequence within this interval. So regardless of howsoever it is done, or let's say if you have hardware support, it can set the page access bit in the TLB. So regardless of howsoever it is done, whenever we access a page, we set its reference bit to 1. Then what we do is that at the end of the timer interval, we copy the reference bit to the copy bit and we set it to 0. So this means that it is ready for the next interval. Subsequently, what a dedicated program can do, a dedicated thread in the kernel can do, is that it can simply traverse the list of all the copy bits one after the other. It will simply traverse the list and it will count the number of ones. So 1 means that it was referenced in the last interval. So it will simply count the number of ones and that will give us an idea of the working set, how large the working set is. And of course, what we can do is that we can change it. And so what we can do is that we can have a smaller interval. So the smaller interval could be that we interrupt once every 1,000 time units. So one advantage of this is that maybe let's say a certain page was brought in and before the timer passed, before delta time units passed, the page was again swapped out, right? It was replaced and it was swapped out. So in this case, we'll have no record of the page, right? Because, it was brought in and then it got thrown out. So that might, and we might end up slightly underestimating the working set. So for that reason, we could have a shorter interval, a sequence of short ones, like shorter sub intervals, where in each sub interval we track the working set, and ultimately we take a union of all the individual sub working sets that we find, which is exactly this. So it doesn't matter how we do it, but at the end, if delta is properly set to capture the stable behavior of the program, will ultimately end up with a valid working set. So there is a more direct approach. So basically what we can do is that we can look at the page fault frequency rate and use a local replacement policy. So if let's say this is the number of frames that we allocate and this is the page fault rate, so what we'll see is that as we allocate more and more and more frames, the page fault rate will reduce. Alright. And if the actual rate is too low, the process will lose frames. And if the actual page fault rate is high, then the process will actually gain frames, in the sense that more frames will be allocated for the process. So it is possible to take a look at this graph, for example, and look at the optimal number of frames beyond which the page fault rate drops abruptly, and that can give us an idea of the working set. For example, in this case, we see that the curve drops. There's a knee of the curve over here. So we can basically say that the working set is maybe somewhere in this range. Somewhere in this range the working set lies, because prior to this the page fault rate is high and after that it is much lower. So this can give us, and this is another estimate, a better graphical estimate of the real working set size. So there is a direct relationship between the working set of a process and a page fault rate, in the sense the working set changes over time, and the page fault rate also changes over time as and when the program's phase changes, in the sense what it does changes. So when we start the program, its page fault rate will be high, then gradually it will reduce because of the fact that pages are being brought in. So during this period, it is expected that it will have a stable working set. Subsequently, it is possible that the program can move into another phase. So again, its working set will change and the page fault rate will become high, then it will become much lower. It will again enter a stable phase. So this is typically the way that most programs actually behave. Now, given the fact that we have discussed virtual memory, we have discussed the way in which user processes are allocated memory. So let us now look at the way that kernel memory is allocated. Of course, parts of the kernel these days run on virtual memory, so that remains the same. But when you are actually talking about the real challenges of kernel memory, we are actually talking about physical memory. So kernel memory is treated differently from user memory. So it is often allocated from a free memory pool. So kernel requests memory for structures of varying sizes, because kernel has a wide range of data structures. So it does request for all kinds of structures. Some kernel memory needs to be contiguous, some doesn't have to be contiguous, but one big example of kernel memory that has to be contiguous is device IO. So assume an external device that wants to write directly to main memory. So in this case, we don't want to give it a fragmented space. Otherwise, the device will not. So the DMA controller, so basically the connection happens via the DMA controller. The DMA controller will not really know how to navigate the main memory or the virtual memory subsystem. So that is why when we are considering device IO, it is much better if we are given one large continuous space. So one such approach is the buddy system, where we allocate memory from fixed size segments that consists of physically contiguous pages. Okay. So the key idea of the buddy system within the kernel is the power of two allocators, which means it satisfies requests where the size of each request, size of the memory requested, is a power of 2. If that is not the case, we can always round up the request to the next highest power of 2. So whenever you need a smaller allocation than what is available, so let's say that we have a large chunk which is, let's say 64 KB, but I am interested in a smaller allocation. My smaller allocation might be, let's say 12 KB. So let's consider a simple example, let's say it's 30 KB. So then what I do is I split this into two chunks, again power of 2, 32 and 32. I round up 30 to 32 and assign, let's say, this chunk to the memory request. So the current chunk, in this case 64 KB, is split into two buddies. So they are known as buddies. So essentially we are rounding them to the next lower power of 2, which is 32. And then again, what we are doing is we are assigning one of the chunks to the request. So an example is also given here. Let's assume 256 kilobytes is available and a kernel request for 21. So we first split it into two parts of 128 KB each. One of the 128 KB chunks is again split into two parts, 64 KB each. It's further split into two parts, CL and CR, 32 kilobytes each. And then one of the 32 KB chunks is given to the request. Of course, there is some internal fragmentation because the request was 21 KB, but that's okay. We will learn how to live with that. The other advantage is that as and when these memory chunks are freed, so let's say that there was one 32 byte chunk, 32 KB chunk which was not used, and another 32 KB chunk was used. Let's assume that this got freed now. So what we do at that point is that we merge both of them and create a large 64 KB chunk. So the disadvantage, as we have said, is always you can have fragmentation, you can have internal fragmentation. Along with that, you could have external fragmentation. So that issue is there, but nonetheless, this is one of the most common methods for allocating physically contiguous memory within the kernel. So this is a graphical view of what we are doing. So in this case, we have a 256 KB chunk. As you can see, it is split into two equal parts, 128 and 128. 128 is again split into two equal parts, 64 and 64, which is again split into two equal parts, 32 and 32. The slab allocation mechanism is an alternate strategy. It's a different strategy. A slab is defined as one or more physically contiguous pages, and we can have a slab cache, or it's just called a cache, where a cache will contain one or more slabs. So basically, a cache is a collection of slabs. So for every unique kernel data structure, we'll have a single cache, and each cache will be filled with objects, and these objects are instantiations of the kernel data structure. So it is filled with objects which are instantiations of the data structure. So of course, when the cache is created, it is filled with a large number of dummy objects which are marked as free. And then when we actually store objects in the cache, then they are marked as used. So basically how exactly does this work? So the way that this works once again is that we have a cache. We have a structure called a cache. It doesn't look like a real cache, but it's called a cache. Within a cache, we have these large regions called slabs, and a slab has nothing to do with any specific object. It's just a sequence of pages. So within a slab, what we do is that let's say the size of a slab is 8 KB, and let's assume the size of an object is 1 KB. So now we know that the maximum number of objects that it can contain is 8. So then, so what we do is that we partition the slab into different objects where each object is of the same size, right? And each of these objects is assigned. So whenever, let's say, the kernel wants an object, we essentially allocate memory area in the slab, and we already know the size of the object, and then it is assigned to the kernel thread. And of course, if we store a structure here, we have an external metadata along with each slab, which indicates, let's say, if the current object is used or it is unused. Unused basically means you have the space for it, but this space is not being used as an active object. So now what will happen is that if, let's say, there are 8 objects can fit in a slab and the slab fills up, then we say that the slab is fully filled up, and So what we'll now do is that for any subsequent request, you will find an empty slab. So every cache has a list of empty slabs. If I were to just draw it slightly beautifully, every cache over here has a list of empty slabs. Once a slab fully fills up, what we do is that we allocate the next empty slab, allocate space from the next empty slab. And in the next empty slab, let's assume it is this one, the one that I just drew. What you would do is you would have some more metadata which indicates which part of the slab are used and which part are unused. So what we can do is we can take an unused region, fit an object within that unused region and return a pointer to it to the kernel thread. So one benefit is that we have very little fragmentation over here, the way that we are allocating memory, and also requests can be satisfied rather quickly. So this is an example of a slab allocation. So let's assume we have 3 KB kernel objects. So what we are going to do is that let's say we are going to create a cache where this block is a cache. So within each cache, what we will do is that we will have pointers to slabs, where a slab is a set of physically contiguous pages, right? So basically what we can do is that we can assume that these are the two slabs, and within a slab, let's say these two objects are allocated. And similarly, we can have another region. So let's say we could have 7 KB objects. We can again have a cache for that with a set of slabs, right? And where a slab is a set of physically contiguous pages. And let's say we could start allocating objects from within those slabs, as you can see over here. So Linux has a slab allocator. So one of the most key data structures for Linux is struct, task struct. So this is very important because it is basically the data structure that maintains the status of the process, right, of the process or of the thread. So that's the reason it's so important. So it requires approximately 1.7 kilobytes of memory. So the moment that we have a new task, we allocate a new struct from the cache, right, a new object from the cache, which is of the type struct task struct. And as I just said, every cache has some amount of metadata that allows it to track which slabs and which areas within each slab, memory regions within each slab are free. So then it takes one such memory region, returns a pointer to it, and that becomes a pointer to the object, and the object in this case is struct task struct. So a slab, so as you can see, this basic idea is that a cache consists of one or more slabs. A slab is one or more physically contiguous pages where we basically fill it with objects. Okay. So a slab as such can have three possible states where we can say that the entire space is used, it is full. The other state could be empty, which means that the entire state is free, it's empty. Partial could be a mix of free and used. So upon a request, what does the slab allocator do? Well, it finds a free struct in a partial slab. Okay, so you will typically not prefer empty slabs, but you will go to one of the partial slabs, find a region over there. So let's call that a free struct. Free struct means a structure, a region to hold a structure that is free. So you return a pointer to one such region. If there are no such pointers, we take one from the empty slab. And of course, if there is no empty slab, then we create a new empty slab. So we augment the cache with one more slab. So the concept of slab started in Solaris, so now it is widespread in almost all kernel mode OSs. So Linux 2.2 had slabs, now it has both slob and slub allocators. A slob is a simple list of blocks where this is mainly for three kinds of objects, small, medium and large objects. And a slub is performance optimized, it's a performance optimized slab. So in general, what was there is that in many of these allocators, we also had per CPU queues such that we didn't have to go to a global queue. Okay, so within per CPU queue, we were able to get objects. So there are numerous optimizations of this nature that are there in the slab allocator. And as I said, they have complicated metadata. So of course, you can consult the code of the kernel to look at all the other kinds of optimizations that such allocators typically have. The primary difference between the buddy and the slab allocators is that the buddy system basically relies on powers of 2, in the sense that we initially consider a large chunk of memory. And then let's say that I want to allocate some memory. Then we start out by splitting this. So we split this into two parts, again split it into two parts, and ultimately we give it a chunk of memory which is the closest higher power of 2, right? And so that's the way that we search. So the memory is organized as a tree structured fashion as compared to slabs, where the idea is that we'll have a cache, and the cache will contain a set of slabs, and each slab is a contiguous chunk of memory, contiguous chunk of physical pages. And within that, let's say within each slab, we'll just partition it among different objects of the same type. Okay. So every object, let's say if it's 2 KB, then fine. For a 4000 KB structure, 4 KB roughly, we can have 2000 such objects. So we have metadata to find out which region is free. And whenever there's a request for an object, the object can be given from the slab. Now let's look at few other considerations: pre-paging, page size. So TLB reach, inverted page table, program structures, and so on. So this is what pre-paging means. So what happens is that, let's say when a process is starting up, we'll have a lot of page faults. The primary reason being that none of the processes pages are in memory. So what we can do is we can prefetch the pages. So this is also called pre-paging. And we can take some of the pages a process will need before they are referenced. In the sense, we can predict, quite similar to what we do in computer architecture. We predict the set of pages that we will require beforehand, particularly before process startup, and then we fetch them. Of course, if these pages are wasted, then both IO and memory bandwidth both are wasted. All right. And so what we will do is that we will assume that S pages, let's say, are pre-paged, and a fraction alpha of these pages is used. So what we need to find is that the amount of useful data, which is S times alpha, is it saving page faults? In the sense, is it greater than or less than the cost of pre-paging, which is the cost associated with fetching the data that is not used, which is S times 1 minus alpha. And of course, different operating systems will have different trade-offs, so that needs to be taken into account. And we would want that alpha is as high as possible, because if alpha is low, then needless to say, pre-paging loses, right? So the advantage of pre-paging as such is gone. Let's now look at the second lever that we have, which is changing the page size. So in general, changing the page size on a stock commodity CPU is hard, because the page sizes are roughly fixed to be 4 kilobytes. So that is difficult. But let's say if it's a custom CPU, or assume that it's an embedded CPU. So at that point of time, we'll have to take these things into consideration. Notably, we will take fragmentation into consideration, in the sense if it's a large page size, internal fragmentation could be an issue. If you have too many pages, the size of the page table itself could be an issue. And furthermore, when you look at resolution, you'll also have to take a look at the access pattern. If the access pattern is truly random, in the sense we are just accessing bytes at random, this set of bytes over here, those set of bytes over there, and if the access pattern is random, then there's no point in having a large page size. We should instead have small page sizes. This will reduce the amount of internal fragmentation, in the sense that it's not internal fragmentation, but the point is that we'll not fetch that much of useless data from the lower level. As opposed to that, if the access pattern is sequential, then of course we can just sequentially walk through the page table, and this will give us a high performance. IO overhead is important, because we don't want to have too many page faults. If you have too many page faults, there will be a lot of IO requests, and these IO requests add to the IO overhead in a certain sense. The number of page faults, of course, because if let's say we are accessing a large contiguous region, then having a huge page is a good idea. That will reduce the number of page faults. On the other hand, if let's say we have a pretty random access but we have a large page size, that will not help, it will only increase the amount IO overhead. In this context, locality is important, particularly as we have seen in the context of NUMA processors. And then TLB size and effectiveness, which we will see next in the next slide. What you have seen, by the way, up till now is that all page sizes should be a power of 2 and should be some power of 2, so that is required. And on an average, page sizes are growing with time, but 4 KB seems to be standardized. It's just that modern processors provide many options for having larger pages. So now coming to TLBs. So TLBs, as we shall see, also interact very closely with the notion of huge pages. So we can define the notion of the idea of a TLB reach, which is the size of the TLB in terms of the number of entries multiplied with the page size. So this is defined as the TLB reach or the reach of the TLB. So clearly we want this to be as high as possible. Ideally, what we want is that the working set of each process will fit within the TLB in totality. Otherwise, there will be a very high degree of page faults. So one thing we can do to improve the performance of the TLB is that we can increase the page size. Alright. So what we can do is that we can increase the page size, particularly if we have a sequential access pattern. So then what we can do is that if let's say there is a large amount of sequential data, we can have a huge page that contains all of it. So then it is guaranteed that we will have no TLB misses within this and all our translations will go through. Of course, there is a problem that if we can't predict this very well, there will be an increase in the amount of fragmentation, internal fragmentation particularly, and this will lead to a loss in performance. That's the reason what is done is that we are provided with multiple page sizes. So we have applications that require larger page sizes, so then the opportunity to use them does exist. And all of this pretty much depends upon the skill of the application writer. So operating systems still do not, to a very large extent, automatically set the page size. They do take cues from the application writer to set the page size. The program structure is important. So let's assume that we have a very large array where each row is stored on in one page. So there are several ways that we access the array. For example, what we could do is that let's say we could access the array like this, that we first iterate over j, which is the set of columns, and then we iterate over I, which is the set of rows. All right. So this approach will lead to a very large number of page faults. Right. So the point is that if let's say data is stored row wise, then what we are basically doing is we are jumping from row to row. So we'll have a massive, very large number of page faults. In comparison, what we could do is that we could scan a full row, then look at the next row, next row, next row, and so on. So here the number of page faults is much lower. So many of these optimizations can be implemented by the compiler. So the compiler can kind of make the code page fault friendly, but ultimately the onus is on the programmer to make the code page fault friendly. IO interlock. So it is something that we have been discussing in the context of double buffering. That let's say there is a region in memory and we have asked the DMA controller to do some DMA, read the disk and let's say put in data over here. There can be a necessity to temporarily lock the pages in main memory, because otherwise if the pages are swapped out and some other processes pages are brought in into the same physical frames, there could be an error. All right. So they are selected from eviction by a page replacement algorithm, and this process is known as spinning. We have seen that if we don't want to do that, then we need to use double buffering, which means that, let's say if you're reading from the disk drive, first it reads in pages into the kernel's buffers, and those buffers are pinned. And then from there it comes to the user space, which means that the user space pages can change till a long time until the kernel is actually ready to copy them, which can be done quite quickly because that is a memory to memory copy and it doesn't involve slow IO devices per se. Let's now look at the example of two operating systems, Windows and Solaris. So this uses demand paging for sure. So all modern operating systems use demand paging with clustering. So what clustering does is it is a form of pre-paging. So it brings in pages surrounding the faulting page such that, so this is like kind of a prediction such that we do not have additional page faults. Alright. Then processes are assigned a working set minimum and a maximum. So the working set minimum is the minimum number of pages any process is guaranteed, any active process is guaranteed to have in memory. This is primarily to stop thrashing. And again, there is a maximum such that even other processes can run. So this maximum limit is primarily to allow multi-programming. Furthermore, when the amount of free memory in the system falls below a certain threshold, the working sets are trimmed, the amount of free memory is restored, and trimming will basically involve swapping out pages, so sending them from main memory to the disk, to the backing store. Solaris is an advanced version of Unix, so it has a slightly different idea. So it maintains a list of free pages to assign faulting processes. So it has several data structures. Let's look at them. So lots free is a threshold parameter. It is the amount of free memory that you need before you begin paging. Des free is basically a threshold parameter to increase the amount of paging in the sense that, let's say, the number of free pages for a process falls below that, we start more, paging more, bringing in more. And min free is another threshold parameter to begin swapping. So there is a separate page out process that uses a modified version of the second chance algorithm. It's also called a clock algorithm because we essentially scan through all the pages and again we scan through once again. And of course, we can scan them at different rates when we are particularly looking at page reclamation. So in general, there are many parameters associated with this process of paging and page reclamation and so on. And most of them have to be set with fairly detailed simulation studies. The notion of priority paging does exist where we give priority to certain kinds of pages. Let's say, for example, we give priority to code pages. Why would that be? Well, the reason is that code pages are used very often. So there are actually several reasons why code pages are given priority. So let me maybe list some of the main reasons. So one reason is that typically programs execute in loops. So given that they execute in loops, the same piece of code is used again and again and again, and the number of code pages is few, so we can give priority to them and pin them in main memory. The other reason is that programs are far more sensitive to any TLB misses or anything with code. And so, the sensitivity is much higher. So this is a computer architecture reason. And also it is that code pages can be shared across processes or maybe two invocations of the same program. So given all of this, code pages are in general given more priority as compared to data pages. So Solaris has, as we can see, it has a for depending upon the amount of free memory, it has a scan rate where you scan the amount of free pages and you take different decisions that can include pinning pages, increasing the working set size, reducing it. And so I'll not describe this in more detail, but you can take a look at these parameters from the text, lots free, des free, and min free, and correlate this with this figure, which correlates the amount of free memory with the scan rate. Scan rate is the rate at which we are scanning these pages. So this brings us to an end of chapter 10. So we are finally done with all memory related operating system functionalities. So now next we will move to storage.